Welcome to this week's Treasury Career Corner Podcast, where I interview Treasury professionals about their Treasury careers. Each and every week, I talk to Treasurers about how they built their careers, where they are now, and where they see both themselves and the Treasury profession going to next. In this week's show, delighted to be joined by Forrest Cebold, the Treasurer at Freeport LNG. Now, Freeport LNG, founded in 2002, basically they're in the oil and gas industry. And that's a big key feature of Forrest's background. And I'll get him to describe that, both the company and, as always, go through his background. We had a pre-podcast call, as always. And one of the key things we brought out on that was discussing about some of the interviews that people go through in their careers and things like that, and about how essentially, if you're the last man standing, or the last person standing rather, that, you know, you get the job and things like that. So I think that's something that's going to come out later on in our discussions. But first of all, Forrest, who, although he's actually from Texas or based in Texas, he's actually now in Colorado. So he's looking at this beautiful vista. I'm looking out at some foam in my podcast shed, which is lovely. Very jealous, but he's got his coffee there. So hopefully he's ready to go. Forrest, take us back to where you started your career, how you discovered finance and treasury. As always, it's over to you, sir.
Great. Absolutely. Thank you very much, Mike. I appreciate the introduction.
Pleasure.
Okay. I was able to start out in my very first job out of undergraduate school. It was a smallest startup company, and I had the opportunity to kind of be exposed to all three, which I'll call financial areas. Let me elaborate that on a little bit.
Yeah.
The areas I'm talking about are basically accounting, budgeting and forecasting, and then treasury. So I was exposed to all those three areas quite extensively over a 3 or 4 year period. And that's when I kind of realized, of all those financial functions, I like treasury the best. And why I like treasury the best was because when I thought the actual subject matter was a little more exciting in terms of investments and debt management. And also, I like the fact that treasury, as opposed to some of the other financial functions, is outward focusing. And what I mean by that is when you're in treasury, you focus a lot of your interactions with people are outside of your company. There's also functions inside that you're focused on, but outside, you do a lot of work with the banks and other financial institutions, which I really enjoyed. So that's where I kind of decided, well, I want to get into the treasury function within the finance function. Now, I really value the experience I had in accounting and in financial planning or budgeting, because it does definitely help you in the treasury field. But I definitely identify myself as this is the area that I want to focus on. So I realized at that age and that point in time, to get ahead, I really needed to kind of specialize in treasury and what do treasury professionals really look for in terms of hiring. And there were two things at that time in my career, and one was an MBA. And so I realized that's what I needed. So I went back part-time and got my MBA, which is, it's a busy schedule when you're working full-time and going to school part-time, but that's what was needed. And secondly, I decided that you need to get the certification that's most applicable to Treasury. And at that time, it was called a Certified Cash Manager. Subsequent to that, they now changed it to a CTP, Certified Treasury Professional. So I was able to get both of those accomplished, and then I was able to basically get a treasury job. I had to switch companies, and that kind of goes to one point I wanted to make is, you have to kind of be committed, right? Committed to the treasury function. Yeah. If your career is important to you, you're going to have to make sacrifices. And one of my sacrifices was, well, I'm going to have to go to school part-time, take some time away from the family by doing that, and of course, get the certification. So I think with any professional career, you're going to have to identify that what your area of interest is and the sacrifices that you have to make to kind of distinguish yourself in that field. So that was what I was able to do. And then again, I had to take a job at a company that was less than ideal. And when I say less than ideal, it had financial difficulties, but it at least enabled me the opportunity to get into the field of treasury, which I decided I wanted to do. And that's one of my overall points is if you want to advance in your career, you're going to have to be flexible. We all want to work for, a company that's very successful and very fun to work for, and everyone knows of the name, and it's a very proud organization. That's not most organizations. Some are going to be, financially not, you don't want to say precarious, but maybe they're not as profitable as you'd like them to be. Maybe they're in an industry that's not as attractive. Let's face it, the power people need treasury people too. So do the sand and gravel people. So you've got to be, if you're a treasury professional, you've got to focus less on, I want the ideal job with the high-tech company that's very attractive. Well, I'm going to look for the best opportunity I can get. So I was able to get in on the ground floor within Treasury and really learn about all the various functions within Treasury. And so I was able to, get the staff position and then, quickly moved up to the supervisor position there. And I think the way you have to do that is you have to kind of focus on, let your boss know that your career path includes a supervisory or manager level position. So they know that right away that while you're currently hired as a staff person, your immediate goals are to get to a manager position. I was able to do that, fortunately. And then that company, after a few years, I did leave that company for another opportunity. My first job was actually in aviation, and the second job was in healthcare. So that's an important part of Treasury is I don't think it's as industry focused as some of your other careers. If you're an engineer or something like that. But money is fungible, so it's less of a focus on the industry and more on the actions that you're doing.
Yes,
because it's a very similar process whether you're negotiating a loan or conducting cash transactions. You could be in various industries. Like I said, I started out in aviation, was healthcare. And then the healthcare company was relocating to Philadelphia, away from Dallas, Texas, where my current job was. And I had heard about that. I wasn't sure. And I was very fortunate. I saw an ad in the newspaper, and that's the way most jobs were found back then. Ads in the newspaper. Now it's totally different. Wow. I'll get into that later.
Yeah.
And how the recruiting of Treasury has evolved over the years. Anyway, so that's, people rarely get jobs now through the newspaper. Anyway, I was able to get a job at Super Club Corporation, and I was able to get a job. I moved up from manager Treasury to assistant treasurer. And Super Club Corporation was actually a retail holding company. So again, a different industry, right? We sold video stores and CDs. So in the CDs, back in the day, people had CDs that you listened to. That's obviously gone by the wayside. But that was even a retail establishment. So, and again, it's a totally different industry, right? From healthcare and aviation, but it's the same concepts where you're managing money. This company was a little more internationally focused. We had stores throughout the UK. And that's one thing that I think I wanted to target myself in terms of a career. I wanted international exposure. So that's an important aspect of the Treasury professional. I think if you want to get into Treasury, because it opens the door for more jobs. There's more jobs in the Treasury function that have an international focus. So, and when I say international focus, that means like bank accounts that may be outside your home country, foreign exchange activities. So if you want to focus on international Treasury, it tends to look better on your resume and also expand your knowledge and expand how attractive you are to potential employers.
Yeah. So we're going to move through some of the other industries you've done as well, but because what I want to also, perhaps focus on, you've got the exposure in terms of international scope of a role, which obviously varies according to different companies. But as you've moved through, you've also had different companies that have had different levels of capital intensity, if you like. So capital intensive business, manufacturing, pharmaceuticals and things like that. How important do you think that is versus industry as such? Is, you can be in different industries, but they're both capital intensive or less capital intensive, maybe a service industry. That's perhaps where it's more, where it differs. Is that right, would you say?
To an extent, it depends what function you're at within Treasury.
Right.
If you're in the capital raising function, right? So in other words, if you're responsible for debt management, debt issuance, or equity issuance, that becomes critical. Now, if you're working for a private company that's privately funded, that's a totally different aspect in how you raise capital. Yeah. You're dealing with partners and things like that. So again, some Treasury roles are capital raising intensive and some are not. And like if you get to a private company versus a public company, that's a big aspect. And then after I moved I was at Super Club Corporation, and they were bought out, and that's a career change that was forced upon me. And that may happen in your career, where you're working for an organization and they're purchased by another organization. You've got to be proactive in that situation and identify decision makers at the company that's doing the acquiring to let them know you're very interested in staying on with the company. Because I falsely assumed the CFO was going to be looking out for all of us. And that wasn't the case. All right. So my advice would be if you're in an organization and it's being acquired by another company, which very well may happen, we know with the amount of merger and acquisition activity that's going on in the world, be prepared, be proactive, and reach out to the company that's doing the acquiring the decision makers, probably the senior financial people or senior treasury people, and let them know you're interested, you're flexible, and you're willing.
And make sure you're on their radar as a potential person.
Yeah, as opposed to having you think of someone in your organization is going to look out for your interest because they're focused on their career and they're focused on, maybe their next opportunity, when really the decision makers are going to be at the company that's doing the inquiry.
So, Forrest, you were at Super Club and then you made that move to ENSCO. Can you perhaps talk us through what made you made that move and how did you find the role? What actually happened with yourself?
Absolutely. Super Club Corporation was in the video CD rental business, and that was acquired by Blockbuster. So it was an acquisition. So unfortunately, at the end of the day, I was out of the role and out of the job and had to move to another company. I found the job at ENSCO via the newspaper. And obviously that has really changed over the years and how you find those opportunities. And it was a very different role in terms of the industry, right? Super Club Corporation was a retail holding company, and ENSCO is an international energy company. So it's also public, whereas Super Club Corp was a private company. And the role was similar in the aspect that I was in the treasury team, but I moved because it was a situation where I had to move down a little bit. Sometimes you have to move down to move up. Mm-hmm. I was the assistant treasurer at Super Club Corp and became the treasury manager at ENSCO. So again, I think parts of my being flexible to keep my career going, so to speak, I had to take a step back, go down a level, if you will, to a different title to kind of stay employed. But that's okay because it allowed me an opportunity to move into, like I said, a larger public company where the structure is very different than a private company. You've got the ownership structure is obviously shareholders as opposed to individual or a series of individuals. And also usually the debt section management is different. You may have public debt. And when I mean public debt, I mean debts that is owned by public in the form of bondholders versus usually just maybe like a bank facility at a private company.
You've got a number of roles within oil and gas, and that was your first role within that industry as well. So a move across from a private group to a public group, but in terms of industry, what was that move like? Making the move into oil and gas.
Well, retail it was a little more progressive industry, obviously. So it was a more diverse work environment, whereas oil and gas is very traditional in nature. It is a different culture. It's a little more male dominated, so to speak. That again goes to being my point about being flexible. You've got to kind of adapt to the culture of the company. You want it to be fair and honest, but on the other hand, you've got to realize that every company has its own culture, and you've got to adapt a little bit to survive often.
You've done some big stuff, and we've got some guys listening today that might be, in smaller groups, private groups, as you say, and things like that. Your treasury career has weathered those storms. Talk us through, from ENSCO and then carry on the development, if you would.
Sure. Yeah. And like I said, when I moved to ENSCO, I quite literally have to take a pay cut. So that kinds of terms of flexibility. You can't always just focus on the compensation, right? I mean, that's a big component. That's why we're all working, but you can't make that the sole driving factor because that tends to limit you. And again, it's more important to get your foot in the door and then make yourself valuable to that entity. Yeah. So I think that's one thing about being flexible. And I'll talk about this a little later in one of my other treasury moves is you have to be flexible in terms of geography. And that may or may not always be the case for you individually, but I think it's important if you're really truly committed to your career to be flexible geographically. So anyway, I had to kind of take a step backwards, right? I went from being the assistant treasurer at Super Club Corp to being the treasury manager at ENSCO. So again, it was a bit of a step back. But you have to do sometimes what you have to do. And I was fortunately, I worked there a long time, able to get promoted to the assistant treasurer, and learned at that time, a lot of the international focus that we talked about earlier, because we had operations really probably about 30 countries, and with bank accounts in all those countries and operations in all those countries. And certainly a focus on pretty much a global footprint, about 40% of our business being international. When I say international, I mean outside of U.S.
So when you have that, because there's, again, a lot of the listenership is coming from within the U.S., and you've worked in both sides and things like that. How do you manage those international relationships as you're, growing through your career? Is it, constantly reaching out to those guys and keep them on side, or is it because we're talking pre-Zoom, pre-Zoom calls? Is it just hitting the phones, or how did you manage it?
Exactly. Yeah, it was hitting the phones, and building a relationship is just that. I think you have to make a constant effort. And I think it has to be a meaningful effort. When I say meaningful, you have to work on it to build that rapport. They have to build your trust. If they're asking information or asking assistance of you, because that's often the case, right? In Treasury, you're often at the corporate location, but you're dealing with banks and individuals that are away from the corporate office. So you've got to realize that situation. They always, most of the field locations that you're dealing with, look at Treasury and look at the corporate office as overhead in reality, because the revenue is being made usually in the field or at this other location. And so you've got to kind of build their trust and build the focus is on helping them do their job, because that's really, at the end of the day, that's what they're trying to do. Yeah. Looking at, like you said, looking at the value that you can add to them and to their job. And at the end of the day, that's how you build a relationship, right? And that's how you build value, because you're providing information or assistance to them. They know that you're then the person that they can go to if they need help, or that they respect enough that, if there's an issue, you want to make sure that they can pick up the phone or send you an email. So I think building that relationship takes, like I said, it takes effort, and it takes constant effort. You don't want to just talk to them or deal with them or send them an email when you need something. Let them know that you're reaching out to them and ask them if they need anything. So I think that's important. You got to realize that, time zone differences and there could be language issues. There's certainly currency issues that you need to consider when you're working with international. Their currencies are going to fluctuate. They're focused more on their currency than they may be on the U.S. dollar. So you got to really look at it from their perspective.
No, and then walk us through them from, Transocean, Lufkin, and more recently Freeport, because again, I know we're on a time deadline today and I don't want to lose, run out of time, because then you were assistant treasurer and then made the move to treasurer. Just talk us through those, if you would.
Sure, absolutely. Yeah. That goes into kind of my overall career advice and how I was able to move from ENSCO to Transocean. At ENSCO, I worked for a gentleman, Ramon Yee, who was the treasurer of the company. And I'm going to talk about one of the ways to move up. And one of the ways is to, kind of ride the coattails of someone or make an impression on an individual such that if they move to somewhere that's maybe a little bigger or more lucrative, that they'll hopefully, when times come, they'll realize that you're the candidate that they want to really bring along. That's how I was able. My boss moved from ENSCO, which was a company that was, it was probably about at that time, it was probably close to a $1 billion company in terms of revenues, to a company of Transocean, which was quite a bit bigger. And he was the treasurer, and he was the treasurer then at Transocean. Well, lo and behold, he made me an offer to be the assistant treasurer at Transocean. So that's how I was able to get that opportunity. But again, it talks about the commitment I made earlier in terms of being able to be flexible. And the reason I say that is because my original job at ENSCO was in Dallas, Texas, and the Transocean job was in Houston, Texas. Right. So I had to move, and that's a pretty big, significant move. My family was established and, very much at home in Dallas, Texas, but, we all decided to make the move. So that goes to my point earlier about being flexible geographically. I had to make the commitment to move. And it turned out to be a pretty good move for me. Transocean's, a bigger company with more international exposure. We're actually based in the Cayman Islands, and that had its own interesting aspects. And also and then we moved the company headquarters to Switzerland. So I was able to stay there as the assistant treasurer. And then, as the case, sometimes Ray, my boss, moved on. He moved on to another company. So you have to kind of be prepared. If you ride the coattails of someone, you got to kind of be prepared that if they move on, you may have to move on. Yeah, time to go. So yeah, exactly. So that was exactly what happened at Transocean. And then I moved on to Lufkin Industries. And again, I talked about being geographically flexible. Lufkin Industries was in a smaller town in East Texas, gave me the opportunity to be treasurer. So with that, I was willing to, move her to a smaller town to get that treasurer title, because that was kind of the goal, right, that I had all along. If you look at my career, I kind of had to move up. Yeah. Yeah, I wanted to get to that level. In order to get to that level, I had to be flexible to change companies and also to change in terms of geographic location.
And what would the contrast for you? What was the Okay, it's a step up, assistant treasurer to treasurer. The buck stops with you maybe a little bit more, or, probably did already. But was there any other contrast or the things that you really noticed? Whoa, hang on, I'm now the treasurer. Was there anything that you picked out that, again, for the listeners today, that they should be thinking about when they're making that move to the number one job?
Well, I think, as with any move up the organization, you have to be prepared to realize what that entails. Now, obviously, people often focus on, oh, wow, it's going to be, it's more money and it's more prestige. Well, yes, that's true, but it's also going to be more time. It's going to be, probably more effort. It's probably going to be more stress. It's certainly going to be more responsibility. So, with each move, that tends to, they run in parallel.
Yeah.
So I think you just have to be prepared for that. You're going to have to be prepared for that move in terms of, okay, be careful what you really want, right? And if you really want that, that's fine, but just realize what goes along with it. And be prepared. That's what's going to happen. You'll have more people working for you, so you'll have more personnel issues to deal with. Odds are when you move up the organization, and because your organization grows under you, you're dealing with more people.
Yeah. And when you did that, when you got the treasurer role and things, what was it like for you, managing a team and leading a team? Obviously, you've been the number two for a number of other years and roles. Yeah. What was that like then, suddenly being the lead, the full-on leader?
Well, I thoroughly enjoyed it because a couple of reasons. One, like you said, the buck does stop with you. So, you are the decision maker often, and you have to live with those results. But I absolutely enjoyed that. And also, you have the direct ear of the CFO. Whereas, usually if you're the assistant treasurer, you've got to go through the treasurer to get to the CFO for most items. So that was one thing that really helped. You've got the direct ear of the CFO because you usually report to the CFO. So you've got more influence at the company than when you're at that level, certainly. So you can make a bigger dent, you can make a bigger impact, but you've got to realize you can make a bigger impact positively and negatively.
Yeah.
So you just got to realize that when you move to that level of an organization, what happened. Like I said, I was ready for that, and I really wanted that, and it was part of my overall career goal. Mm-hmm. We'll talk a little about this later, but there was a very different interview process than the other interviews I've been on. The advantages I've had of changing jobs so much, I've interviewed a lot, which could be viewed as a negative or a positive, but you got to realize every interviewer is a little different. And then that company was bought out. Again, there's another buyout scenario, right? That company was bought out by GE Oil and Gas, and which is a very different company. I went from a company with about $1.5 billion worth of sales to $150 billion worth of sales. Wow. So our organization was 1% of their sales, and that really wasn't my ideal situation. The very, very large company where I felt like I couldn't really make much of an impact. So while they did keep me on, and I was employed by them, it really wasn't an ideal role. So I kept on looking for jobs, and while I was working, it's the easiest to find a job when you're looking for a job. That's very true. And also, you're just more appealing. When you're looking at a resume and you see the gap, it always just raises a bit of a question in the interviewer's mind. So it's always best to look for a job when you have a job. So that's what I was doing at that point in time. And it's funny because I was interviewing for 2 jobs at that time, and you can tell when you're on the short list. Because, you've gone through several interviews. You're actually with the CFO and maybe even the CEO of the organization. And I was interviewing for 2 jobs, both in industry, both in Houston, both treasurer level position. And the job I thought I really wanted, I did not get that job. But Freeport LNG did. I did get that job, fortunately. And ironically, it turned out that the job that I thought I wanted, that person I didn't. I actually ended up meeting the person later on, and about a year ago, that person was laid off. So my point being there is, you never know what job is ideal for you until it kind of gets there. And this turned out to be when a Freeport LNG turned out to be just a fantastic job. Kind of my current career goals and career management, and I can elaborate on that a little bit more. Is I'm at a stage in my career where I don't really need to be managed much, at least that's from my perspective. So I'm in a situation where my boss really lets kind of make me do what I need to do, and it really works out well in terms of my relationship with him and throughout the organization.
But Forrest, we'll come back to that about empowering your staff and things like that in a moment. If you could, let's just talk, just again, if you could explain to people what Freeport is about, your current company. And then what I'd like to do is, broaden it into some of your other views, because I think people will get, we've only got 20 minutes running, and I want to make sure that the people listening today get the most out of it. I think you got some great views on recruitment and things like that. So just tell us, about Freeport as a company and things.
Right. Yeah. Freeport LNG the LNG stands for liquefied natural gas. Mm-hmm. So we're fortunate in that we're in a very narrow area of the oil and gas industry that's doing well. Because as we know right now, the commodity prices aren't too high, and most people are not doing that well in that sector. But all we do is we liquefy natural gas. So the United States has an abundance of natural gas. So we're fortunate that we just liquefy it, and then that it gets shipped around the world. And if you remember anything about Chemistry 101, the only way you can liquefy any gas is to supercool it. So it shrinks about 600 to 1 from a gas to a liquid, goes on a tanker, and gets shipped throughout the world. So that's what we do from a productions perspective. Again, I'm the treasurer, so I deal with, capital raising and moving money and managing money and debt management, things like that. But that's what our particular yes, that's what our particular industry does. So,
and I said we said earlier about the global is a big part of your ethos or the sort of your responsibilities. When that comes down onto a people level, and this is where we're going to start to broaden back into that and bosses and things like that. But again, there are some treasurers in the US, for instance, who will deal with lots of people, but they literally will just talk to people in their own country in the US because, it's big enough, fair enough. But you obviously have an international outlook. How have you seen that over the years? And obviously that's been a key part of your history and background. But, how do you manage all those different relationships and things? We talked about being on the phone and stuff, but, do you see there are different ways to approach problems, or what do you think?
Yeah, I think you need to gain some in-country knowledge, maybe about their particular banking system, and every country is different in terms of how they operate their banking systems. Certainly the UK is different than Japan, that's different than Brazil. So I think one aspect is to gain some general knowledge about the way the banking system operates there, who the major players are. When I say major players, major banks are within that country. Certainly you want to get a feel for the currency itself that dominates that country, right? Is it a floating currency? Is it pegged to the US dollar? Is it an open currency? Like the Egyptian pounds are very, it's a very controlled environment. It's very hard to get Egyptian pounds. I mean, it's very hard to convert the Egyptian pounds to US dollars, I'd say. So I think you need to learn about some of the details of operating within that country from a treasury perspective. And again, that's banking, that's currency related, that's, how funds are moved in and out, historical interest rates and things like that. So I think you've got to learn about the country itself to help you kind of operate within that country. Even if you never get to physically go there, you understand how to operate in there in terms like from a banking perspective and from a local operations perspective, because that's who you're supporting, right? You're supporting your local operations often.
That's really interesting. But what I want to do, again, because listeners were here, we got to make sure that we get enough time of yours, which is fantastic. We spoke before today. You've got a fascinating career where you've made all these moves. Some treasurers will be 20 years in one job. So their knowledge of making moves and recruitment and the market in that sense is more limited than yours. Now, there are 2 or 3 points I wanted to make. We'll come back to about being a boss and empowering your team and stuff in a minute. What I wanted to do was jump in on it's easier to find a job when you're in a job, and about being the last person standing, because we spoke about this before and I thought we had some really good views there. So if we just look back at your career and when you were easier to find a role versus when you perhaps maybe when you weren't in a role, how did you find that made your processes? Because I think certainly when I've spoken to people sometimes there's a slightly different thought process. When you're a treasury professional, you're between roles, you don't have a role at that time. Whereas when you're in a role, certainly when I put candidates forward for roles and things like that, they're much more relaxed if they've already got a job. And it makes you make the right choices because you're not thinking, crumbs, how am I going to pay the bills next week? It's much more, well, the bills are paid. Am I just choosing this role for the right reasons? Have you found that yourself with your career?
To an extent, yeah, I think that's true. I think you're obviously much more selective. When you're looking for a job, you're going to pretty much jump on the first opportunity that comes along. It may not be, like I said, the greatest company in the greatest industry or the greatest compensation level, but you're going to kind of make that move. And if you can, start to look for your job when you're in a current role, you're much more controlled in your decision making. And you're much more in tune with red flags too. If something comes up like, whoa, whenever you interview, you always want to ask, well, how was this position created? Is this a growth situation? Is this a situation where this person was terminated? Right. The red flag goes off as well.
Yeah.
We can't seem to fill this role with the right person, right? You get, this role's been open every year for the last 3 years. Well, that's a red flag.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So that's kind of situation. Well, but if you're at the point where, you really need a role, you're going to kind of look through that. Whereas I think if you're just, you don't need the role, you're going to say, okay, and, probably move on. I think, in terms of, when you make that decision that, you're going to look for another opportunity, I think really you kind of have to do the homework up front.
Right.
In other words, you can't say, boy, I'm going to start looking for a job. You have to work on, you have to make sure you build up your network before then, right? Because sometimes that may be the opportunity that you need.
Brilliant.
So in other words, and that's a skill set to build up your network. And how do you do that? It kind of goes back to what I alluded to before. You've got to stay in touch with people. Yeah. And you've got to connect with them on a regular basis. And sometimes it could be nothing more than an email, or it could be nothing more than a phone call. And you've got to identify people that, you kind of value in terms of your career. And it doesn't have to be necessarily people that are in the Treasury profession. It could be bankers. Often bankers have great roles because they are in touch with treasurers and assistant treasurers throughout the industry. So I think you've got to kind of keep your network in terms of, people not just necessarily that are in the Treasury profession, but people that know of Treasury openings, and like I said, like bankers.
And Forrest, I think you're making a brilliant point there. And one thing that I've heard from a lot of people, and want you to do the talking, but I was going to bring it up, is that a number of treasurers or senior Treasury professionals only start networking when they suddenly need a job. And it's a little bit,
right,
not desperate, but it's a little bit sometimes, some of the people that, haven't spoken for 5 years. Hey, I'm looking for a role. Do you know things? And they're like, well, yeah, but you didn't bother to be interested in me or things like that. But you are an active networker, which I know is fantastic skill. It's not just your banking stuff and everything else, but, that's obviously really helped you, would you say?
Yeah, absolutely. Because one of my opportunities I found was just through that. It was a banker. Yeah. A banker said, hey, these guys are looking for someone. It's like, whoa, that's great. So I think that's important. You can't just start, I can't wake up today and say I'm going to start looking for a job.
Yeah.
You got to be prepared. It's not just like having your resume ready and having your information out there on LinkedIn, which is good, and you need that. Yeah. But you really have to develop the relationships beforehand so you can kind of use those people. And probably that's not a great term, use those people, but surely have those people help you. And you know what? I've had a lot of people, and I've had a lot of people come to me and say, hey, I'm looking for something. And you know what? And that's great, because then I know if I'm in that boat, they're very much likely to help me if needed. Yeah. Right. So it's a quid pro quo situation when you have these business networks.
And it's cultivating it you're cultivating it in a positive fashion, not just in a, I want to use you to, hop, step, and jump. You help them, they help you, and what goes around comes around. Paying it forward.
Right. And I think that's important too, because I get being as a treasury level position, I get people all the time on LinkedIn that want to link in with me. Yeah. And they may be at a lower treasury profession, and like, I'm not going to just link in this person because I know they just want to try to use me to get a job. Right. So, it's when you build a network, it has to be reciprocal. You have to help the people and they have to help you. So I think that's important in terms of when you want to make that move. You got to build your network. It depends what level you're at too. Sometimes when you're just starting out, and we can go into this a little more, but when you're just starting out, you've got to make sure you kind of check the boxes for those entry level positions. Yeah. And what do I mean by that? I mean by, if it requires a degree in X, you've got to get that degree in X. And you could try to convince yourself that that's not important or that's not needed. But at the end of the day, that's not your decision. That's the hiring person's decision. So you've got to check the boxes like I kind of did early in my career. An MBA, okay, I got that. Okay, the certification, okay, I got that. So you've got to when you're starting out in your career, you've got to check those boxes.
You got to put the work in.
Yeah, and then when you get older, in your career, it's certainly a situation like they don't really look at, where did you go to school? Oh, okay, whatever. They're really looking at maybe some more specific skill sets or specific things you did in your career that they're looking for. And you can't be discouraged if you don't have that. Like one job that I did not get that I thought I really wanted was they wanted someone with IPO experience. Well, I didn't have it at that time.
No.
So, I didn't get the job, but I'm not going to beat myself up over that because I just didn't have that one particular type of experience. But you've got to be prepared, because that's what sometimes when you get to a certain level, that's what they're looking for.
Yeah.
Because everyone they're going to interview is going to have all the boxes checked. They're going to have enough experience. But they may be looking for something that's very specific.
Well, we talked about that, and there's a crossover with that functional thing and industry experience. As I said, at one stage, I was nearly going to be recruiting this treasurer for a consulting stroke engineering firm in LA, and the senior guy there said, have you recruited any other senior treasurers in LA in this industry? And I was like, well, no, because there's just you. It's like you're the biggest company, and as you say, there's certain things you can do. Get people who've got IPO experience, who've got different, but that's more functional experience rather than industry specific and level and everything else. It was just, and again, it's about you developing the other facets of your experience as well, isn't it?
Yeah, and that goes back to when I said be flexible and be proactive. The more kind of experiences you can have within the Treasury function, again, it's like IPO experience or international experience or experience with letters of credit or anything like that, that looks good too, because you may eventually interview for a position where they need that box checked. So that's why I think you got to be prepared to kind of expand your role, prepared to maybe make the move to broaden your experience base. Because you never know when the next recruiter is going to need that specific type of experience.
Apologies to butt in, but we're going to, I know you've got a hard stop in about 5-6 minutes. So before, we leave you today, we're going to go to your LinkedIn profile in a minute. But before we do that, I just wanted to go back, and you talked about, you've worked under various bosses and perhaps reflecting on some of those and the best ones you've had and what you've taken from them to be a best boss yourself and how you've empowered people. I know we spoke about this before the show. Again, what have you seen from people that you've, borrowed from them, as it were? And what should people be thinking about when they're listening today?
Sure, absolutely. I think one, you could learn from everybody. So you could also learn from your boss. You can learn from people that work for you. And be aware of situations. Like if you're working for someone and they kind of ask you, or they in your review process they mention a particular character trait that maybe you don't agree with. Like, I should be more patient. Let's say they say that, and I don't agree with that. Well, but if someone else tells me that same thing, I've got to realize and be mature enough to know, like, oh, I'm wrong there. I need to be more patient. So I think, listen to what people are telling you. It's about being a good communicator. Something like we said, you said before, you have 2 ears and 1 mouth. Yeah. So make sure you use it proportionally. So that's what I would think. I say, listen a lot. Listen to people that are above you. Listen to people that are below you. Listen to people that are across from you. And it's really try to take and use that source. Use them as a source, as a network. Because if you can earn their respect, again, you can kind of ride their coattails. And, people change jobs for all sorts of reasons. And you never know when that person may work for them now, and you may work for them, 10 years from now in a different role, a different company. So, if you've got that, and again, it goes with keeping your network in too. If you really respect someone, if you work for them, keep in touch with them regardless of where they go. I think that's real important. And I still keep in touch with my bosses that are retired.
Yeah.
So I think that's just an important aspect to have. And if you will, we could talk a little bit about interviewing skills, because I've interviewed a lot, and there's certain aspects that I think I've learned over the years. And we talk about that. You've got to understand who you're interviewing, and kind of you got to let them lead. And I've had certain interviews where, they sit back and they'll ask a question, and they expect a long, detailed answer, and they'll ask another question, and that's what they want again. And then I've had interviews where they do 80 or 90% of the talking. And my point there is, whenever you're interviewing someone, you need to let them take the lead, because some people like to talk, right? And they may like to talk about themselves, and they might like to talk about whatnot. And some people want you to talk and you to sell yourself, which is fine, but you just need to be prepared to do either or.
Yeah.
Because you never know how that interviewer is going to be. And at the end of the day, they're the decision makers. So you've got to make sure that, they want you, and they want you enough to bring you back. And I guess that goes to my point we talked about earlier about being the last person standing, because you've got to understand what the interviewer is trying to do in terms of when you interview. They're really just a lot of it's for trying to eliminate people, because it's all about time management. They may have gotten 30 resumes, and they narrowed it down to 10 people that HR is going to talk to, and they're going to talk to 6, and they're kind of working like, well, I just want to eliminate some of these people so I can just kind of focus in on these 2 or 3 candidates. So sometimes you just got to be the last person standing and not have anything that's going to preclude you from being the last person standing. Yeah. And sometimes that goes back to kind of, you do really want to let them lead the conversation if possible, because you don't want to upset them or dominate the conversation. Or on the other hand, if they expect you to have long, detailed answers for every one of their questions, you just have to roll with it.
Yeah.
And if you don't get to something that you wanted to sell about yourself, that may be the case. But at the end of the day, you got to realize that person's making the decision, not you.
Yeah. Well, you have to let them lead. And as you say, it's actually what we call the horns and halo effect as well, because if they focus in on something they really like about you, love their rugby. Oh yeah, it's great. That, great. That's the halo effect, and you're an angel and they love you. Oh, great. But then also, as you say, it might be that they hate sports. And you start to go on about it, and they're saying, well, actually, I'm not interested in sports at all. So, hang on, so back away from that. So I think it's about awareness and that active listening. And it is, a lot of the things that you've brought to bear on today's podcast. So.
Right. Know who you're speaking with. If you're speaking with, in the interview process, you often speak to an HR representative. You often speak to like maybe the decision maker, your boss, and maybe the CFO. Kind of realize that they're all different people and they're all looking at different things. The HR person is going to be like, well, I'm looking for red flags where I can just eliminate this person.
Yeah.
And the CFO is looking for a person like, wait, I want a person that can be a star, and I can maybe move this person throughout my organization. Whereas, the treasurer person may be looking for, I want someone to fill this role, so I'm looking for someone that could really fit in right now. So you got to realize who you're interviewing with to kind of what they're looking for, because they're not all looking for the same thing.
Exactly. So, Forrest, amazing chat today. Let's just wrap up things, because, again, I know that you've got a hard stop any second. If we could, we'll put your LinkedIn details in the show notes so people can connect to you. And I think it'd be amazing for you guys to have you in their network and things. But before we do close it off, just reflecting back over your time in Treasury thus far and continuing it is, what are the key tips, bullet points, if you like, for people that you would say to people that they walk away today and they know about?
Well, one, like I said earlier, be flexible. Absolutely be flexible. And, if your boss asks you to do something, you do it. If this is going to require a move, then maybe you have to move. So the more flexible you are, the more appealing you're going to be to people. Secondly, be sure to kind of, if you need to, tick the boxes, tick the box. Get what you need to get the interview. And you don't try to fool yourself. So maybe, tick the boxes. And lastly, network. Actively network. You should be networking right now and network people. And you never know who's going to be that person that's going to get you that interview.
Yeah.
I mean, that's what I would focus on. And networking is not continue to something that you need to continue to focus on. And the higher up you get, that's the more likely the way you're going to get jobs is through a network.
Exactly right. Yeah. So flexibility, tick those boxes, actively network, not just occasionally, which you do.
Yeah, actively network.
Yeah. Amazing.
And also, realize that, who you're speaking with. And
audience.
Like you said, look for cues when you're interviewing, because they're gonna lead you where you need to go.
Yeah.
And know who you're talking with. You like I said, you interview differently based on who you're talking with, whether it's a CFO or, like I said, the treasury person or the HR person.
Forrest, thank you for your time today, sir. We didn't rush. It was great. It was a lovely 40-minute conversation. So this is going to be, freely available I'm looking forward to publishing it, because this is going to be a great one. Thank you, sir. And again, we'll put Forrest's details in the show notes to connect with him. He's a great guy to have in your network, and thoroughly enjoyed it. And we'll definitely do more shows in the future with you, and maybe some more variety shows and stuff. But thank you very much for your time today.
Thank you, Mike. Certainly enjoyed it.